everybody. Thank you for turning up in such large numbers. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. My name is John Simpson. I work for the BBC, have worked for them for a rather disturbing amount of time, and it's my very, very great privilege to introduce one of the, I think, most interesting figures of our time, Jonathan Sumption, who is Lord Sumption, I should say, although, as I understand it, you that was something you didn't actually sort of work for. You just became a lord automatically. Yes. Which is well, he was also, of course, on the Supreme Court without being a full-time judge at any point beforehand. So you can see both the quality of the man and how he's shortcut some of the basic principles of our society. He's actually one of our own in the sense that, well, one of your own. I mean, I went to Cambridge, so you know. But he was a fellow modern historian. I don't have to tell you every Waterstones in the country has his history of the 100 Years' War there. Fifth volume comes out, I think, this year. Are you still writing it?
No, it's coming out this
But no, I mean, when I bring out a book and it's coming out this year, I'm still writing it days before. Anyway, I shall add it to the other four on my bookshelves, which and one day I shall read all five. And you know, at the moment I'm only up to 1349. But anyway, the number of cases, of course, that Lord Sumption has been involved in have been varied and of huge interest. We were just talking about the case of Berezovsky against the famous Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich, but you also, I think, defended the British government against one of the major class actions of modern times, and won. It was the Blair government, I think, and you represented, I think, my I was going to say friend, Alistair Campbell, but during that whole business of the Hutton inquiry and so forth. And you're still a judge in the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. I'd like to ask you a question about that, possibly at the end. And also, if I may say so, one of the great Reith lecturers of our time. I don't know how many people listened here to the Reith Lectures in 2019, but I really, really recommend them, and magnificent and absolute tour de force, as you might imagine. Recently, an article in the Spectator, which you wrote, was headlined "The Cringing Self-Abasement of Britain's Museums," from which I think, I get a slight indication of what your feelings are about these things, and I'm looking forward to it absolutely tremendously. You're going to talk tonight about the new Roundheads, politics, and the misuse of history. So afterwards, I'll ask Lord Sumption some questions, and I think we're going for a really, really good afternoon here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome all of you. Over the past 2 decades, a number of intolerant ideologies have swept through the worlds of learning, literature, and the visual and performing arts. This evening, I'm concerned with one of them. Its essential features are the diversion of academic disciplines to a task for which they are usually extremely ill-suited, namely the reform of modern society so as to redress perceived inequalities, particularly of race. Now, in the course of this exercise, some of these disciplines have been discredited and others distorted, generally with little or no factual basis. The study of history is particularly vulnerable to this kind of process. Most historical scholarship involves judicious selection from a mass of source material, which is usually vast and usually incomplete. This means that it is possible to create an entirely false narrative by exaggeration and tendentious selection without actually lying. The major threat to historical honesty comes when the criteria of selection are derived from a modern ideological agenda. And what we have been witnessing is the reshaping of the last 4 centuries of history to serve as a weapon in current political disputes. Objectivity and truth have been the main casualties. I want to start with a very well-known example because, although it may seem a bit hackneyed, it perfectly illustrates the problem. In November 2022, the Wellcome Collection, a museum dedicated to the history of medicine, announced the closure of Medicine Man, an exhibition of artifacts relating to the history of medicine, which had been collected by its founder, Sir Henry Wellcome. The decision to close this exhibition was itself perfectly reasonable. As a collector, Sir Henry Wellcome was a bit of a magpie, and the exhibition itself, which was 15 years old, was rather fusty. However, what mainly attracted attention was the statement which the curators published on Twitter to the effect that they had closed it because it, quote, perpetuates a version of medical history that is based on racist, sexist, and ableist theories and language, unquote. Now, to understand this statement, it is necessary to go back 2.5 years to an earlier announcement by the Wellcome Collection in June 2020, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Under the heading Anti-Blackness and Racism, it declared that the Wellcome Collection was built on racist and patriarchal narratives, and that institutional racism was enmeshed within its fabric. It went on to say that not only the Wellcome Collection, but all museums were built on a foundation of white supremacy and had for years replicated racist behaviors. The curators declared their intention of continually asking questions, I quote from them, about power, representation, and the civic role of public museums, and focusing on the lived experience of those who have been silenced, erased, and ignored. Now, what does this all mean? It is palpably untrue that medical history, as presented in Medicine Man, was based on racist, sexist, and ableist theories. Certainly, museums reflect the historical outlook of those who assembled their collections and their successors who curated them. In Britain, these people were generally able-bodied white males. But museums do not, simply by virtue of that fact, replicate racist behaviors. Nor does our culture silence or ignore non-European experience where it is relevant. I think that what the curators meant to say was that the exhibition treated medicine as essentially a Western science of which non-white groups were passive consumers with no contribution of their own to make. And this, they felt, implied a hierarchy of cultures in which the West was regarded as superior to the rest, a notion which they thought offensive to non-Western racial groups. Now, the Wellcome Collection is not alone in taking that view. The Museum Association, which represents British museums generally, has called on them all to address colonial structures and approaches to all areas of museum work. At about the time that the curators of the Wellcome Collection published their June 2020 statement, the director of the Royal Botanical Garden at Kew, probably the world's leading institution dedicated to plant science, issued a similar statement on behalf of his institution. It began with the usual confession that its history had, and I quote, shamefully drawn on a legacy that has deep roots in colonialism and racism. The only fact cited to support this surprising assertion is that during the 19th century, the Royal Botanical Garden studied the movement of plants around the British Empire as part of its worldwide mission of botanical exploration. That is said to have made the Botanical Garden at Kew a, quote, beacon of privilege and exploitation. The director went on to declare that Kew would in future decolonize its collections and tackle structural racism in plant and fungal science, with a view to achieving transformative societal change in modern Britain. The inference of this statement is that merely by having existed and collected information and specimens in the great age of imperialism, Kew Gardens was in some way complicit in modern inequalities in Britain. Finally, this. There is no acceptable neutral position, the director said, no acceptable neutral position on this subject, racial injustice. To stay silent is to be complicit. Now, this is an odd thing to say. It seems obvious that one can be a very respectable plant scientist and an outstanding plant historian without taking any view at all about racial injustice. These statements, and there are many others of the same kind, have certain points in common. The first is that they are proposing a political program for the modern day, supported by a highly selective approach to the past, which sees everything through the prism of race. Race becomes the supremely important phenomenon, masking every aspect of a complex culture. Racial politics provide the framework of values by which institutions concerned with the past fall to be judged. Now, there are many factors in the way in which human societies develop. Race is only one of them, and not necessarily the most important one. Any serious commentator on the current state of historical studies in Britain ought to welcome attempts to present aspects of history which have been previously ignored or marginalized. That includes the story of ethnic minorities and of non-European societies. But it does not mean that the whole of Britain's modern history should be viewed through their eyes. It does not mean that the role of slavery or empire in Britain's economic, cultural, and social history should be exaggerated beyond recognition. And it does not mean that current political priorities should determine how we understand the past. The second thing that I think that these statements have in common is that they lose sight of the broader evolution of human history. Benjamin Disraeli once observed in response to an anti-Semitic taunt in the House of Commons that while the ancestors of the Right Honourable Gentleman were brutal savages in an unknown island, mine were priests in the Temple of Solomon. Victorian elites undoubtedly regarded their own civilization as superior to others. That has been a universal habit of humanity ever since the Greek city-states and the ancient dynasties of China dismissed the whole of the rest of the world as barbarians. If these prejudices were ever justified, it is only for short periods of time, 2 or 3 centuries at the most. Empires and cultures are transient. They have their periods of power and creativity and generally fade away. medicine is as good an example as any. White males have not always dominated medical science. There have been periods when major contributions came from non-European cultures, Chinese, Indian, and Arab in particular. Historians have not ignored this. They have not effaced or marginalized it. Great books have been written about it, almost always in European languages. The 26 volumes of the History of Science and Technology in China by the Cambridge scientist and historian Joseph Needham is one of the most remarkable works ever written on the multicultural origins of modern science. It is not alone. But this should not blind us to the fact that the 3 centuries before the Second World War were European centuries in medicine as they were in other sciences, with very few exceptions, such as the use of some medicinal plants. Indigenous non-Europeans contributed very little. If one looks across a broader chronological range, the picture is very different. But calls for the decolonization of academic disciplines hardly ever do that. They generally focus selectively on the 18th and 19th centuries and seek to debunk one of the few indisputable facts about that period, namely that it was a period in which cultural and scientific developments fundamental to the modern world almost all emanated from Europe or from European settlements elsewhere. Museums have been among the most visible and vocal exponents of current calls for decolonization. But they have in fact affected almost every intellectual discipline concerned with the past, and many which are not concerned with the past. One does not need to go very far from this building in order to discover some remarkable examples. In this university, the Faculty of Classics is one of many which have made a public statement about the legacy of colonialism. Their statement declares that the origins of Oxford classics are embedded in a 19th century colonial context. This is said to be because of what the document calls civilizational thinking, by which is meant the view that there is a hierarchy of cultures with the West at the top. The document goes on to point out that when classics became a distinct school at Oxford at the beginning of the 19th century, English elites were in the habit of viewing the classical world as a superior civilization and were adopting classics as a guarantee of their standing of their own civilization. Now, all of that is true, but has nothing to do with colonialism or empire. It originated in humanist educational ideals of the 16th century, which were common to all of Europe, including countries with no colonial tradition at all. The same educational ideals, concentrated on the classics, were, for example, prominent in Germany, whose universities were at the time major centers of classical philology, archaeology, and history, long before Germany developed colonial aspirations of its own towards the end of the 19th century. Decolonization has been demanded of many other disciplines which were never in any meaningful sense colonized: visual arts, music, literature, philosophy, and even the physical sciences and mathematics. The only connection between these fields of study and Europe's imperial past is that the West achieved a dominant position in them during the imperial era. The decolonization statement of the mathematical, physical, and life sciences division of this university reveals the same obsession with race and the same tendentious attempt to portray racism as a perennial theme of Western thinking. The division's statement begins by seeking to discredit its own subject by referring to the scientific racism of the 19th century, which posited a racial hierarchy identified by physiological characteristics, a view which no serious scientist has entertained for many decades and which has no current relevance to the subject. The statement goes on to identify science with empire by pointing, in rather the same way as the Kew Gardens statement, to the Victorians' collection of material samples and botanical specimens across the globe. Moving to the present day, it calls for a study of deep-rooted racial biases in digital technology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Now, one would have thought that these subjects were incapable of racial bias. But as the statement proceeds, it becomes clear that the object is in fact to redefine knowledge itself in a way that artificially devalues Western scientific achievement. As we work towards greater inclusion, it declares, we need to have a broader understanding of what constitutes scientific knowledge. Among other things, this is said to require, and I quote, challenging Western-centric ideas of objectivity, expertise, and merit, and removing structural hierarchies that privilege certain knowledge and certain peoples over others. But it is clear that the authors of this document regarded science as racially biased because the scientific method, as it had been conceived in Europe since the 17th century, had privileged certain empirical research methods of a kind which had their origins in European culture. Now, there are two basic ideas behind statements like these. One of them is about the nature of historical truth, and the other is about inherited collective guilt. The repeated emphasis on challenging the structures of power, which one sees in statements like the statement by the Wellcome Collection and that of the Mathematical, Physical and Life Sciences division of this university, is an echo of the teaching of postmodernist philosophers like Michel Foucault. Foucault was the leading exponent of the idea that objective truth is unattainable because truth is by its nature subjective. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, published in 1969, Foucault taught that the structures of power within a society determined what was generally perceived to be true. Now, few people outside the discipline of philosophy have read Foucault's works, but many more people have read Edward Said's influential book Orientalism, published in 1978, which applied Foucault's ideas to the legacy of the great European empires. Now, Said argued that powerful groups control the intellectual framework within which ideas are discussed, and thereby determine what constitutes knowledge. Historical truth, he claimed, is not actually discovered. It is created by historians in accordance with unconscious prejudices and biases moulded by the power structures of the society in which they live. Now, the power structures, he felt, which had enabled Europeans to dominate much of the world between the 18th and the 20th centuries, had generated a view of the world based on a hierarchy of civilizations which patronized and marginalized non-European peoples. According to Said, this frame of mind persisted even up to his own day, and had led modern scholars to construct a narrative of the past which treated non-Western races as representing an earlier stage of human evolution, less valid than the more developed experience of Western countries. The task of the historian was therefore to deconstruct the hegemonist West and to substitute a different power structure in which other people's truth could be acknowledged. Now, these ideas have been extremely influential among many people who know nothing of their origin and have never themselves heard of either Foucault or Said. In 2015, the organisers of the campaign to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes from its niche outside Oriel College issued a pamphlet entitled Our Aims. Their purpose, it said, was to suppress the frame of mind which that statue symbolised. It was to, quote, remedy the highly selective narrative of traditional academia which frames the West as the sole producer of universal knowledge by integrating subjugating local epistemologies. When, 3 years ago, the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum decided to invite a Maasai shaman to divine which objects from its Maasai collections had been stolen, and resolved to repatriate the ones that he designated, she was giving practical effect to the idea that modern historical and archaeological methods are no more valid as a route to truth than mystical divination employed in other cultures. If truth is subjective, then every ethnic group is entitled to its own truth, and the whole concept of objective knowledge disappears. Let me now turn to inherited collective guilt. The argument is that if people once suffered from what we now regard as injustice at the hands of our forebears, we owe it to their descendants to make good that injustice. Now, one thing that the history teaches us is that injustice, as we conceive it, has been the lot of much of humanity at most times. Much of the history of the world is a history of the brutal exercise of power, tyrannies, wars, massacres, persecutions. Historically, most people at most times have abhorred democracy, rejected political and religious tolerance, and regarded the very idea of gender or racial equality as ridiculous. Now, what are we to do about this now that we all think differently? Logically, perhaps, humanity at large ought to atone for its own past. After all, injustice is indiscriminately distributed across the continents and centuries. But at that level of generality, the gesture would be largely meaningless. It would deprive what is in reality a political program of its political force. So the call for atonement for heritable guilt is directed against some specific sector of humanity, say white people, or the British, or Oxford University. Now, this is not only irrational, it is, as I think would become clear if people thought more carefully about it, it is also morally repellent. Historically, the idea that particular groups bear an inherited responsibility for some past iniquity have been the basis of ugly prejudices and vicious persecutions. In this country, the desire to visit moral responsibility for the past on some identifiable sector of mankind has generally focused specifically on Britain's involvement with empire and slavery. Now, nobody would today defend the worst moments of the British Empire, the rapacity of the East India Company before its political and military operations were brought under government control at the end of the 18th century, the Opium Wars, the Amritsar Massacre, and so on. But it is a gross offence against historical honesty to take all the worst features of some historical phenomenon and then serve them up as if they were the whole. Throughout history, empire and armed migration have been part of the dynamic of human development. The values which we regard as characteristic of Western civilization were born in the societies of ancient Greece and Rome, both of which were founded on slavery and on imperial conquest. The bloody conquests of the Arabs in the 7th and 8th centuries gave rise to a remarkable Middle Eastern civilization, far more impressive than anything to be found in Europe at the same time. The rise of modern Japan as a technical and industrial giant had its origin in the forcible opening up of the Hermit Isle in the 1850s by the American Navy. The British colonial empire had the same catalytic effect on the world. It was created and sustained by force, or by the threat of it, as all empires, indeed all governments, ultimately are. It denied self-determination to its indigenous populations until its final years. Yet it was also a remarkable administrative and cultural phenomenon. Those who governed it were guided by a variety of motives: patriotic, economic, military, geopolitical, evangelical. But at least in the last century and a half of its existence, these people were also infused with a strong streak of humanitarianism and idealism. The empire suppressed a variety of barbarous practices which it would have been politically convenient to tolerate, including cannibalism, suttee, human sacrifice, and slavery. It brought spectacular economic development, creating global networks of shipping, railways, and telegraph, and injecting capital and enterprise into local economies. It brought relative peace, honest administration, and the rule of law to large parts of the world. It built great world cities: Mumbai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney. Now, our forebears believed that good government was better than self-government. They also believed that trade and economic development were better than cultural autarky. These are unfashionable views now, but there is nothing morally disreputable about them. Would sub-Saharan Africa be better off if Europeans had left its peoples to their own devices? Would modern India be better off if it had not inherited its subcontinental identity and economic infrastructure from Britain? Would the world as a whole be a better place if Europeans had never settled in the Americas or in Australia? I do not think so. Slavery was once among the most ancient and persistent institutions of mankind. The Arabs and the indigenous rulers of pre-colonial Africa were probably the greatest slavers who ever existed. The involvement of the Atlantic nations is by comparison much more recent. It began with the Portuguese in the 15th century and the Spanish in the 16th. Britain was the last country to take to slave trading on a significant scale, and the first country to reject it. In societies imbued by Christian moral teaching, slavery was only ever defensible on the footing that black people were not really human. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, the rise of evangelical Christianity in Britain led to a major movement of moral revulsion against that idea. In 1772, the Court of King's Bench declared that the English common law did not recognize property in another human being. The slave trade was criminalized throughout the British Empire in 1807, earlier than any other country except Denmark. Slavery itself was abolished by statute throughout the British Empire in 1834. For the remainder of the 19th century, Britain deployed its considerable diplomatic and naval power in suppressing the practice, initially on the Atlantic coasts of Africa, and then in the African interior and the Indian Ocean. The polemics surrounding Britain's involvement in the slave trade concentrate on its participation in the 17th and 18th century slave trade, while ignoring or belittling its involvement in the suppression of the trade in the 19th century. Yet historically, the latter seems very much more significant. The 18th and 17th century slave trade was in line with the conventional moral values of the age, but its suppression in the 19th century was revolutionary. It went against the tide of opinion elsewhere, in Europe at any rate, and against Britain's own economic interests. The global consequences were immense. The sheer size and global reach of Britain's colonial empire was the biggest single factor in the suppression of a practice that had existed across the world from time immemorial. Now, to many people, all of this is beside the point. Their real concern is with the present and with those aspects of the past which serve their arguments about the present. Their anger against the past is provoked by a small number of totemic issues of which race and empire are much the most sensitive. Now, these issues are totemic because the position which one takes about them is seen as a symbolic statement of which side one is on in the broader battle to shape the future. When an issue acquires totemic status, the actual facts disappear from view. The issue becomes a mere occasion for political self-expression. Hence, the vandalism of statues and campaigns to rename streets and buildings. The statue of Edward Colston in Bristol was erected to honour his foundation of schools, hospitals and almshouses in Bristol. Tobias Rastat's monument in Jesus College, Cambridge, was put there to mark his generous gifts to the college. All Souls College Library was once named after Christopher Codrington to mark his funding of one of Oxford's great institutions of learning. All three individuals had some involvement in slavery, but none of these monuments and memorials and dedications commemorated that aspect of their lives. The objection to them suffers from the same partial vision of the past as the unbalanced historical accounts of Britain's imperial record or its involvement with slavery. Once a person or an institution is touched by slavery or empire, nothing else about them matters, however important or admirable. This marks the extreme point which tendentious selection can reach. David Hume is thought unworthy of commemoration by Edinburgh University because he shared the patronizing indifference of all his contemporaries to other races. Yet this is a fact about Hume which is of very little importance when measured against his stature as one of the intellectual giants of the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment. In the eyes of a significant minority of the British population, judging by polling evidence, most of them young, Winston Churchill has become a mere symbol of English imperialism and racism. Far more significant aspects of his life, such as his contribution to Britain's survival in the Second World War and the destruction of Nazism, are swept aside. Does this matter? I think it does. The civilization of mankind since the 17th century has been based on the notion that there is such a thing as objective truth. It may be more or less difficult to identify with confidence, but it exists. In history, the difficulty of discovering the truth is due to the uneven survival of sources and to the problems of interpreting those that we have. It is not due to inherited prejudices or ideological mental blocks. We have traditionally built our intellectual world on the basis that we get closest to the truth by objective study of the available material, by abandoning immovable preconceptions, by logical reasoning, and by willingness to engage with dissenting opinion. Whatever the mathematical, physical, and life sciences division of this university may say to the contrary, these are not just Western constructs. They are universal principles which are necessary if we are to discuss controversial questions in the same language. There is no alternative route to truth dependent on different racial identities or different and conflicting hierarchies of power. Yet these basic principles of rational discourse are now challenged. The repudiation of Britain's past in the name of a modern political agenda is currently a minority position. That much at least is clear from polling evidence. But there is a serious risk that it will become the orthodoxy of a future generation. It is strong in some important groups, notably the young and politically active, and a vocal contingent in the academic world. It may not be a passing phase. The habit of reinforcing one's political instincts by adopting whatever facts suit them is too deeply ingrained in human nature. Today, it is intensified by the social media. They are a major source of information, especially for the young, but they are curated by algorithms which amplify views that already exist, suppressing nuance, balance, or doubt, and giving a misleading impression of a great tide of opinion when the material is often generated by a handful of fanatics. Those who believe that knowledge and truth are mere social constructs are almost bound to end up by suppressing competing opinions. If what we think that we know is actually no more than an artificial consensus created by power structures invisibly controlling our schools, universities, publishers, and museums, then there is no point in debate. You have to change the power structure to take control of those institutions and create another consensus. And that is what is now being attempted. It is being attempted with the enthusiastic support of many of the institutions in question. They lack the self-confidence to stand up for a rational approach to empirical knowledge and understanding which alone justifies their continued existence. Now, I am not going to suggest that modern academic scholars on the British Empire and slavery are all determinists in the mould of Foucault and Said. Some of them are, most are not. However, their treatment of the past often shares the three main vices of postmodernist history: tendentious selection, exaggeration, and intolerance of dissent. In 2017, this university announced its support for the Ethics and Empire project, whose object was to explore the moral and factual basis of the conventional hostility to the British Empire. This provoked vocal opposition from many academics in the field. On Twitter, calls by a professor in the English faculty at Cambridge to shut the project down were answered by gross personal abuse. That is the level to which in some quarters academic debate on an important issue has fallen. Another opponent of the project, a professor of history at King's College London, was quoted in The Guardian as saying, and I quote, "Any attempt to create a balance sheet of the good and evil of empire cannot be based on rigorous scholarship." Now, it is quite rare to find a serious scholar overtly rejecting the very idea of balance in the assessment of controversial evidence. But it should be a lot rarer than it is. The fact that his protest was supported by 170 academics in various open letters sends a depressing message about the current state of scholarship on this issue. It also explains why scholars who dissent from the current orthodoxy find it wise to keep quiet about it if they value their careers. Now, this has an impact well beyond the academic world. Every human society depends for its cohesion on a sense of collective identity. The French historian Ernest Renan, in his famous Sorbonne lecture of 1882, entitled "What is a Nation?", argued that the solidarities which created a nation were primarily historical. Renan's target was the ethnic nationalism and social theories peddled by overt racists like Johann Herder and Arthur Gobineau. National identity, Renan argued, did not depend on ethnic or linguistic solidarities. It depended on a shared history of collective effort, collective sacrifice, and collective devotion. It depended on a consciousness of having done great things together in the past and wanting to do more of them in the future. Renan's definition is a lot pithier in French. Avoir fait de grandes choses ensemble pour vouloir en faire d'autres. Now that brings one to one of the great ironies of modern debates about the past. Those who claim to be champions of ethnic minorities are seeking to undermine Britain's past as a source of collective solidarity. They are reverting to morally questionable notions of conflicting ethnic identities, which can only fragment our society, obstruct the integration of minorities, and undermine any sense of community. The problem is aggravated, in the case of race, by a notion of hereditary moral responsibility, which requires one to recognize an entirely artificial class of modern victims defined by race. The result is to perpetuate grievances on account of past events which have no practical relevance to modern lives. Democratic institutions only work if people accept the legitimacy of their decisions even when they disagree with them. For that to happen, they have to identify themselves with the wider society to which they belong. The fragmentation of a society's historic identity can only hinder that process. The problem is aggravated by the intolerant and polemical tone that characterizes much of what is written and spoken about Britain's past. The great apostle of Victorian liberalism, John Stuart Mill, foresaw that the main threat to its survival would come not from the authoritarian state, but from the conformity imposed by collective opinion. Current campaigns to vilify parts of British history are an attempt to create a new conformity, a situation in which people will not dare to express contrary opinions for fear of provoking outrage or abuse. These are symptoms of the narrowing of our intellectual world. Recently, a publication of a book written by the director of the Oxford Ethics and Empire Project was indefinitely deferred, in effect rejected, by Bloomsbury, the publisher which had commissioned it, on the ground that public feeling would not support its publication. This is the mentality which Mill and other apostles of liberal values dreaded. We will never understand the past unless we recognize that human beings are light and shade and acknowledge both. Few individuals and no societies have ever been wholly good or wholly bad in any age, and this mixture of darkness and light is a critical part of the process by which human societies develop. We can celebrate the achievements of our forebears as well as learning from their mistakes and iniquities. To reject what is wonderful and fascinating about humanity in favor of a monochrome view of the past dictated by current political priorities is obsessive and fanatical. It is also very bad history. I have entitled this lecture The New Roundheads, because the object of these campaigns is essentially destructive. What their partisans have in common with the original Roundheads of 17th century England is a deadly combination of dogmatic intolerance and sanctimonious Philistinism. The earlier Roundheads ultimately failed in their attempt to produce a uniform culture in England according to their own narrow vision of virtue. A civilized society, I would suggest, should wish the same fate upon their modern successors. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for starting us off our inaugural Pharos Lectures in such a devastatingly intelligent, thoughtful, and of course controversial way. And I don't know, I imagine there are plenty of people here who wouldn't agree with some of what you say, and a great many who would agree deeply with it. Can I ask you, first of all, do you think that British governments, perhaps the British royal family, should be apologising for things like the Irish famine, which the Queen more or less did when she went to Dublin, about what happened in India at times, which has also seems to have come from the royal family and also from one or two politicians. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the royal family's input into this is very much dictated by the views of ministers, by constitutional convention. I am opposed to historical apologies, except for things that happened in the relatively recent past, because it seems to me that the whole notion of historical apology is necessarily built on a notion of inherited collective guilt, the notion which I have sought to criticize in my lecture. I think that we are not entitled to claim a vicarious pride from the past, but neither are we obliged to accept a vicarious guilt from the past. We weren't there, we didn't do it, we think differently now, and it seems to me that the whole notion of historical apology can only serve one end, and that is to perpetuate historic grievances which will be better laid to rest.
What are your politics?
I don't have any. I genuinely don't have any. I have voted in every election since 1970. I have voted for all the major national parties at different times, I have to say, during that period. Currently, I am politically homeless.
You were closely associated with Sir Keith Joseph, weren't you?
Yes.
In the 70s, who was Margaret Thatcher's great guru, economic guru. Have you moved away from that kind of approach?
When I worked for Keith Joseph in the mid-70s, I was a Labour voter. Now that may cause some surprise, but Keith Joseph was very well aware of it. And one of the things about Keith Joseph is, that, first of all, he was one of the very few conservatives of that period who really thought seriously about social issues and issues connected with deprivation. And he was a man of very broad political curiosity who was perfectly happy to work with people who disagreed with his politics. That's what I liked about him.
And a very charming man, too.
Indeed.
Do you believe that there is a hierarchy of civilization with the West on top?
It depends on the time frame. The answer, put as generally as that, is no, I don't. But there have obviously been periods when the West has been the source of almost all the more fertile ideas which have subsequently been disseminated across the globe. The period, I think, is relatively short. I think it starts sometime in the 17th century and ends in the middle of the 20th. I think that we are looking at a period in the next few centuries in which the West is unlikely to be as dominant a source of fertile and creative ideas as it has been for the last 3 centuries. This is the dynamic of history. It's the point of my citation of Benjamin Disraeli's jokes. The fact is that civilizations wax and wane, and the West is no exception. but that should not stop us from recognizing those periods of time when it was really critical.
You talked about Foucault, and you talked about Edward Said, whom I used to know. I didn't know Foucault. I remember those years in particular, those very early years when Foucault was propounding his ideas, and Said and lots of other people followed them. That was really a part of that previous upsurge of change and rebellion that happened towards the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. It did, of course, fade away. That surge faded away. I'm not saying the ideas faded, because they certainly haven't, but the notion that we've got to rise up and reject everything that we've become and turn ourselves into a different society. It wasn't just in Britain, as we know. I mean, it was in many countries around the world. That subsided after a while, and the 70s and 80s became very different kinds of decades, and into the 90s. Do you think that this current upsurge in, to some extent, self-revulsion, in turning our backs on what we've done and how we've done and what they meant in moral terms, do you think this also will fade away, or do you think this is it, this is the future?
Well, I think it would be a bold person who said something would never fade away, and I'm not going to suggest that. What I do think is that there are reasons to believe that this is a more durable state of mind than many others that have simply vanished and come to seem in retrospect rather absurd. I agree that enthusiasm for the ideas in Edward Said's book did decline as a result of partly of intellectual objections to his ideas in the course of the 80s and 90s. But it's still a very powerful idea. I was unaware of quite how powerful it was until I, in the course of preparing this lecture, found myself reading the mission statements of many dozens of museums, universities, faculties, and institutions concerned with the study of the past. And it became obvious that these ideas are still vigorous in some places. Will it last? As I said, I think that the fact that this is actually in large measure a generational thing, and the fact that it is intensified by the principal source of information for the younger generation suggests that it will be more durable. I regret that, but I think that realistically it seems quite likely.
But it is a movement of society then. It isn't just a few people, a few scholars and so on. It's the way that we think about ourselves and our past.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
And it's wrong, you would say?
I believe so. I think that it is wrong because it is selective, and selective according to criteria that are irrelevant to the subject that is being considered. It is also deeply intolerant and therefore destructive of the whole process by which we learn in the course of intellectual discourse. We learn by accepting that there are other opinions with whom one must engage, that all knowledge and indeed all opinion is provisional until something better comes along.
You touched on something, but I was expecting you to go deeper into it, but you've done that in your article in The Spectator about museums giving objects back and so on. Are there objects that we should give back? I mean, the Benin bronzes?
Well, the Benin bronzes, the case for returning them is that they were they were looted in the course of the British invasion of Benin in 1897. I think that the rights and wrongs of that incident are very difficult to work out. There are conflicting views, both of them based on different bodies of fact. But let's assume that it was a wholly unjustifiable war. In 1897, the right to take spoil in war was accepted by international law. That may not be a happy state of affairs, but it was not until the Hague Convention of 1899 that nations got together to say that wars should not be the occasion for plundering other societies. I would say that the case of the Benin bronzes is much more nicely balanced than, for example, the case of the Elgin marbles, which is currently at the top of the repatriation agenda, essentially because artifacts, particularly archaeological artifacts, have always moved around the world. The Elgin marbles have been in Britain for longer than the Greek state has existed. They are part of the collections of a great world institution, and I think that one has to acknowledge the fact that virtually all the contents of museums of antiquities in the West, which arrived there before about the middle of the 19th century, were basically looted. I mean, it was an age in which archaeologists simply arrived and took away what they wanted without asking anybody's permission. It's not just the Elgin marbles. If you look at the amazing sculptures from Nineveh and Assyria in the British Museum, they were basically dug out of the ground by the French consul without asking anybody's permission, and then before he had time to ship them, snitched by Layard and carried off in a Royal Navy frigate to the British Museum, as it had turned out. Now, it seems to me that this is a fact. It has created a prescriptive rights, a state of affairs, which it would be far more disruptive to reverse now than the original process of removal. At the time that museums acquired these objects, I'm not talking about the Benin bronzes now, but the earlier period, in the anarchic period of international archaeology, Western countries were the only places where anybody actually cared about archaeological artifacts. And it seems to me that we should recognize that the current civilization of the world owes a very great deal to institutions like the British Museum, which are in a real sense institutions of all mankind, and should not be seeking to break up what has been a very great benefit to the understanding of the past.
But we are at a time of reckoning, aren't we? We're at a time when people are looking at the record and how it's been achieved and how it's gone through, and the bad sides of it and the good sides of it. I mean, do you think that we're stuck in a position where we're always going to be on the back foot, always having to defend our behaviour, our record? Or do you think, again, this will pass and might pass, of course, if some of these apparent wrongs were righted?
Well, I don't think that's true at all. It seems to me that if some of these, you say, wrongs were righted, that would simply invite appetite for more. I don't believe that there is such a thing as satiety when it comes to the acquisition of objects for the exhibition in museums. It does seem to me that there is a point beyond which one cannot simply reverse the injustices of the past without creating more injustices, at least as egregious.
When you heard that the Queen Consort wasn't going to wear the Koh-i-Noor diamond in her crown at the coronation, did your heart lift, or did you say, I think that's a really bad thing?
I responded with complete apathy. I can understand the mere existence of resentments, whether justified or not, may be a sufficient reason for the royal family to avoid controversy. I don't regard myself as being bound by the same convention.
What's gone wrong with history?
Well, I've sought to explain what I think has gone wrong with one aspect of history. Fortunately, it only really affects the history of the last 4 centuries. In general, I think that in earlier periods, history is in a pretty good shape. The standard of research, the standard of objectivity is pretty high. But there is a big question mark over whether one can say that about the history of this country since the 17th century.
I mean, Chris Patton would, I suspect, say that a lot of what academic historians are doing and saying is because they're nervous. They're nervous about their careers. They're nervous what their students will say and how they will be treated. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. Fortunately, I have specialized for most of my life in a period which is regarded as too ancient to provoke that kind of reaction. I mean, the trial of Joan of Arc was in many ways an outrage, but I don't think you find people complaining very vigorously about it.
Well, I must say I must disagree. I was beaten up in Paris in 1976, I think, in a demonstration close to the statue of Joan of Arc, and I was told in no uncertain terms this was because of who I represented and where I came from.
Right. Well, perhaps I should have chosen a better example. But as I suggested earlier, every period of history is full of gross injustices, many of which were recognized as gross injustices at the time. Others have only come to be so regarded in our own day. We have to accept that, and we have to learn from it.
I did think it was rather strange at the height of one of the discussions about Britain as a still an inherently racist society that we actually had only, of course, for a very, very, very short time, but a cabinet in which the 4 top jobs were either occupied by people with African backgrounds or Indian backgrounds, or in the case of the Prime Minister, perhaps I should remind you who it was. It was a woman called Liz Truss, a woman. I mean, this, you would regard this as a sign that Britain wasn't the racist society that we're told sometimes it is, would you?
Well, I would regard it as that. I don't think it's conclusive, because obviously racial prejudice is something that exists at many levels below the level of Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary. And the lower the level at which it exists, the more intractable the problems of getting rid of it. So I'm certainly not complacent about Britain's record. At the same time, I think that this is a very difficult issue on which Britain compares well with many other countries. Although the murder of George Floyd provoked outrage and demonstrations in many countries, including this one, the reality is that although relations between the police and coloured communities are not at all satisfactory in this country, they are nowhere near the state that they have reached in many parts of the United States. I think that we do extremely well on integration by comparison with a much more closely comparable country, namely France, which has a similar imperial background and a similar history as the host to very large waves of migration. We've all set about it in different ways. I think that while there's lots wrong with the situation we're in this country, we are trying, and we are doing better than many other countries.
There isn't the same kind of, I mean, you live several months out of the year in France, I think, don't you? There's not that sort of kind of inherent self-dislike or self-criticism in France that there is here, is there?
That is true, and enviable.
Do you think we'll ever get to that, back to that point, or are we changing so much from day to day and month?
Well, I hope that we will. I mean, there are problems about the French attitude as well. I mean, part of the problem in France is the refusal actually to study or to recognize some of the genuine problems that still do exist there. But you are absolutely right to say that there is no self-abasement, or not much self-abasement in France. It's also fair to say that the evidence is necessarily anecdotal in the face of the refusal of the French authorities to conduct authoritative surveys about it. But it is fair to say, on anecdotal evidence, that there is very strong desire by many ethnic minorities in France to be associated with the idea of Frenchness, including its past, because they see it as a route to integration. I'm not suggesting that the same sentiment doesn't exist in this country, but it is much less widespread.
I'm, I think, 2 or 3 years older than you, and I remember as a boy coming out of the Second World War in the late 40s, the early 50s, people using, without any sort of sense of irony, expressions like British and best. Mm-hmm. And my father saying to me, "Don't make such a fuss about it. You're British. You should behave." But we've lost that sense of ourselves, who we are, and whether we can have a sort of reliance on ourselves about it in terms of our behaviour, haven't we?
Yes, we have. I mean, again, I think that is to some extent a generational thing. I think that older people have not, but, you know, people of your age and mine are heading for the exit door.
Mm. Well, speak for yourself.
No, I think I can speak for both of us.
I'm afraid so. Yes. But it was interesting, wasn't it? The way that that whole dispute about the Rhodes statue really went away. I mean, it was quite strong for a while. Some colleges were nervous about that kind of thing and started putting up signs and talking about taking down statues and so forth. That went away. Rhodes is still up there in the 2 different streets. And do you think that this is how the pattern goes, or do you think that was a particular case?
I don't think it went away, but I think that the intensity has declined a lot. It hasn't disappeared. I think that it could. I think it could well come back. But what encourages these kind of nihilistic movements is the thought that the institutions at which they are directed will give way if you push hard enough. And there was a time when, for example, Oriel College looked as if it was a pushover. It turned out not to be. But with that, when I think the governing body of Oriel went through a number of gyrations, there may be members of the governing body here now, so I'm not going to be any more specific than that.
But you feel that the academic authorities should be firm in their confidence about themselves, or do you think they should be listening to these kind of...
I think they should be doing both. I certainly think that they should listen to objections, even if they don't accept them. What I think that they should, above all, do is stick to some of the basic values of empirical research and of knowledge, which are not subjective, they're not relative. They should stick to the notion that the truth is in principle discoverable and that the object of the exercise is to get as close to it as possible. I think that is a proposition which, judging by the decolonization statements issued by quite a lot of faculties in this university, has been at least temporarily abandoned.
Do you think they were groveling?
Yes.
And what does that say about the state of academia here and in other universities?
It suggests fear. Fear of standing out, fear of appearing to be behind the mood generated by the people whose interests they ultimately are here to serve, namely the young. I think that it is misguided because the object of the exercise is to transmit values, not simply to take the values from those to whom one hopes to transmit them.
So at the moment, the Roundheads are winning, are they?
At the moment, the Roundheads appear to be winning. I suppose one has to take account of the fact that there's usually an interval of some years between the appearance of a thought in a document like a faculty statement on decolonization and a change of mind, so that if this mood changes, which I hope it will, you can expect to see the wreckage of the old state of opinion sitting in these documents for a very long time.
What do you have contempt for that sort of approach?
No, because it's too human. It's too normal for people, particularly in this country, which basically has a very tolerant tradition, to retreat in the face of intolerance. I think that's very unfortunate, but I think it's also, in human terms, very understandable.
But you don't, as I understand it, think that is going to be the wave of the future?
I honestly don't know. I think that it's going to be the wave of the future for quite a while to come, because of the relative uniformity of the people who basically are going to be the future, namely the generation of my children and grandchildren.
If you were still teaching history at Magdalen, would you be afraid that your students would rebel, would make a nuisance of themselves, would threaten you perhaps, would try to chase you out?
Well, everyone who's asked that kind of question is almost bound to say, no, I would be robust. But, we are not all made to be heroes, and I suspect that the reality might well be very different. I hope that I would stand up to it.
I'm sure you would. Well, thank you.
That much obstinacy was of my life, which I didn't originally have.
Thank you very much, Lord Sumption. Thank you. And I think we need to give a really long round of applause.